Forgiveness is the silent act that frees the soul and opens the doors to peace. Among the countless texts that have tried to unravel the mysteries of the power of forgiveness, this book stands out in a special way. It's not simply a collection of ideas or theories, but the anonymous account of someone who, after tirelessly traveling paths of pain and healing, found in forgiveness a key to their own freedom. Despite having read countless books and listened to many voices, what's shared here isn't just knowledge, but deeply felt, lived wisdom. This book invites us on an inner journey, where each page reveals the keys that allowed its author to not only forgive others but also themselves, finding in that act a transformation that goes beyond words. Through their reflections and experiences, it shows us that forgiveness is much more than a concept. It's a force that transcends time, heals the soul, and allows us to let go of the weight of the past to walk toward a more fulfilling and peaceful life. The Power of Forgiveness, From Fear to Faith. Author unknown. The legacy of the past. I've always wondered why the pain we feel sometimes doesn't seem to be our own. Have you ever stopped to think if that deep sadness that invades you, seemingly without reason, might not have its origin in your own life? At first, when I began to discover this possibility, I resisted believing it. I thought everything that hurt me had to do with me, with my experiences. But little by little, life showed me another side of the story. I remember one afternoon, sitting at the old table in my grandparents' house. The silence in that house was different, heavy, as if it held ancient secrets. What stories haven't been told? I asked myself. It was then that I began to notice something. The pain in my chest wasn't just mine. Whose was it then? The truth is, I didn't know, but something inside me knew I had to follow that trail. Over the years, I began asking questions at every family gathering, every casual encounter. I inquired about the untold stories, the uncomfortable silences. Why do we never talk about what happened with Grandpa? I once asked, and my mother's silence was more revealing than any answer. There, in that pause, I understood something. Not all wounds heal right away. Some simply get passed on. We who live in the present sometimes carry pains we don't understand. They are echoes of past sufferings, of generations that couldn't resolve their own traumas. Grandpa, for example, couldn't talk about the war. What effect does silence have on the soul? I constantly asked myself. Now I know that silence isn't empty. It's a box full of unprocessed memories waiting to be opened. But how do you open that box? It was then that I began to write, not to heal my own wounds, but to unearth the stories of those who came before me. In those words, in those family tales, I discovered that inherited pain isn't just a burden, but also an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To free ourselves. We're not condemned to repeat the stories of those who preceded us, but we can only escape them if we first acknowledge them. I wonder if you, reading this, have also felt that weight. Have you ever felt that the pain you carry doesn't entirely belong to you? If so, let me tell you something. You're not alone, and while it seems unfair to bear what others left unresolved, it's also a gift because it's in our hands to break that cycle. With every word I write, I feel a part of me, a part of my family, is liberated. As if by telling our story, I could somehow free us all. Is it possible to heal through words? Yes, I believe it deeply, because when we put into words what has been hidden, we give it light, we give it form, and we transform it. The pain of the past doesn't have to define our future, but for that to happen, we must look back with courage. We must ask difficult questions. Where does this fear I feel come from? Why is it so hard for me to trust? In those questions, however uncomfortable, we find answers that can guide us toward a freer life. I remember a conversation with my mother. Why do we never talk about what happened with your grandmother? I asked. Her answer, a deep sigh, made me understand that what we inherit is not just the past, but also the difficulty in facing it. But that's where our true strength lies, in being able to look directly at what others couldn't. Inherited secrets. Invisible chains. I've always wondered why in certain families it seems there are things you just can't talk about. Have you noticed how certain topics vanish into thin air when you try to mention them? It's as if silence becomes a protective shield, but at the same time, an invisible prison. I remember once when I was young, I asked about an uncle I never knew. My mother looked at me with those eyes that revealed more than her lips wanted to say. "It's better not to talk about that," she told me. But in that moment, I understood that what's left unsaid weighs just as much as what's revealed. What happens with those secrets we carry unknowingly? Sometimes what's not said binds us more tightly than words. Time passed, and the more I tried not to think about that uncle who was never talked about, the more I felt his presence. Can a secret be a chain that follows us even if we don't know it? I began to notice how some of my decisions, the fears that appeared without explanation, didn't originate in my own life. They seemed like shadows of something bigger, something older. It was then that I realized silence isn't forgetting. Silence is a way of keeping alive the stories we don't want to remember. What are we trying to protect with our silences? Maybe it's the pain of not reliving a past wound, but in that act, we condemn ourselves to repeat what was left unsaid. I remember when I finally talked to my mother about that uncle. "Mom, I need to know who he was," I told her one day. She sighed, like someone who had been holding a heavy burden for years, and in her response, I not only discovered the story of a man lost in the shadows of a family tragedy, but I also understood how many of my own insecurities were linked to that silence. Is it possible to inherit secrets? That question tormented me for years. Now I know that secrets are inherited like invisible scars that shape our emotions and our relationships, even if we don't know they're there. We can't see these chains, but we feel them in every step we take, in every decision we don't know why we make. So, how do we break these chains? How do we free ourselves from what we don't know? The answer, like everything in life, isn't simple. It takes courage not only to ask the right questions, but to accept the answers that hurt. Are you ready to discover what lies hidden in your family history? That's the first step toward true freedom. To recognize that invisible chains exist and that we must find them if we want to release their weight. Sometimes, the most painful family stories are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. In my case, when I discovered my uncle's secret, it was as if a light turned on inside me. The sadness I had always felt without knowing why began to dissipate. I was no longer alone with my emotions. Now I knew where they came from. Is it possible to heal something we haven't experienced directly? Yes, it is, because by giving a voice to what has remained in the shadows, we begin to untie the knots of the past. This process of discovery isn't just for you, it's for everyone who came before, and everyone who will come after. Have you ever wondered if the pain you don't heal will repeat in future generations? I ask myself that constantly. That's why every difficult conversation I've had, every truth I've brought to light, feels like one less chain in my family's history. Today, as I write these words, I think about the stories that still haven't been told in my own family. I know some secrets will remain hidden forever, but I also know that I have the power to prevent them from becoming chains for those who come after me. What invisible chains are you carrying? Perhaps you don't know yet. But if you dare to look closer, you might find the key to your own liberation. This chapter is an invitation to look at what has been left unsaid, to explore the wounds that aren't yours, but that you feel as your own, and to break the cycles that tie us to the past. Exploring the origin of fear. The language of anxiety. Anxiety has always been a constant shadow in my life, but I never really knew where it came from. Have you ever wondered why you feel that knot in your stomach when everything seems fine? That's how I felt, as if something was wrong even when there were no obvious reasons. The strange thing is, I couldn't always attribute that discomfort to my own experiences, as if the fear lived in me before it had a name or a form. I remember one particular day when I was a child at my grandparents' house. There was an overwhelming silence in the air. Why was that silence so heavy? Now I understand. It wasn't the silence that unsettled me, but what the silence was hiding. In my family, certain topics were avoided, and as a child, it was enough for me to just sense it. Anxiety isn't always about what we can see or name, but about what we feel without knowing why. Over the years, I began to notice a pattern. That deep fear that seemed to always be there wasn't just mine. Can anxiety be passed down from generation to generation? Yes, and it took me a long time to understand that what I felt was rooted in the unresolved fears of my ancestors. One of the most revealing moments was when I discovered my great-grandmother's story. No one in the family talked much about her, but in her few portraits, her eyes seemed to tell me a story of her suffering. What was she so afraid of? I asked myself again and again. Later, I learned that she had lived through times of war, loss, and constant uncertainty. And it was then that something inside me clicked. Her fear, her anxiety about the future, didn't stay with her. It was handed down to me like a silent inheritance. Is it possible for our ancestors' fears to manifest in our current lives? Absolutely. The anxiety that accompanied me wasn't just the result of my own experiences, but a mixture of all the unresolved worries that had been transmitted throughout my lineage. I began to understand that the feeling of imminent danger, that constant state of alertness, wasn't exclusively mine. It was an echo, a reverberation of the past. One day, while reflecting on all of this, I asked myself, how can something that isn't ours be healed? And the answer came with time, like a gentle breeze that caresses but doesn't push, with compassion, with acknowledgement, and with presence. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we relate to it. Every time I feel overwhelmed by anxiety, I stop for a moment. Where does this fear come from? Sometimes it's hard to find a concrete answer, but other times I feel that the weight isn't mine. And in those moments, I close my eyes and send gratitude to my ancestors because they did what they could with the tools they had, and now it's my turn to transform that legacy. Anxiety can be a relentless teacher, but it also offers us a door to a deep understanding of our roots. What part of your anxiety truly belongs to your family history? That's a question each of us must ask if we want to untie the knot we carry in our chests. I started to notice that every time I confronted my fears with this new perspective, something in me softened. It wasn't an immediate solution to the anxiety, but it was the beginning of a reconciliation. Is it possible to make peace with fear? I believe so, because when we understand where it comes from, it no longer has the same power over us. Today, as I write these words, I feel a calmness I didn't know before. Not because the anxiety has completely disappeared, but because now I see it as part of a path that began long before me. What fears are you carrying that aren't yours? Ask yourself. Observe your emotions with curiosity, not with judgment, and maybe you'll discover, as I did, that there's more to your feelings than meets the eye. Fear has deep roots, but it doesn't have to define our future. By recognizing where it comes from, we begin to free not only ourselves but all the generations that came before and those who will come after. When the past speaks, the hidden language of trauma. Sometimes the past doesn't need words to speak. It manifests in silences, in gestures, in unexplained pains that inhabit our bodies. Have you noticed how sometimes the body expresses what we can't say? That was a lesson I learned slowly, in small doses of awareness, when I began to understand the hidden language of trauma. I remember the first time I felt it clearly. It was one afternoon, as I was walking on a solitary path, when a feeling of anguish suddenly overcame me for no apparent reason. Where did this nameless pain come from? It wasn't something I could point to in my own life. At first, I thought it was stress, everyday anxiety, but the more I explored it, the more I realized there was something deeper, an echo, a whisper from the past. Can trauma hide inside us, waiting for the right moment to emerge? I found the answer by observing, not just my life, but the lives of those who preceded me. I realized that the language of trauma isn't always direct. It doesn't come in the form of clear memories. Sometimes it appears as a shadow that creeps into our decisions, our fears, in those moments when we feel paralyzed for no apparent reason. Have you ever felt that something inside you is stopping you without knowing why? It was when I started asking about my family's history that the pieces began to fit together. I discovered that my grandmother had gone through times of great pain, times she never talked about with anyone, not even with her children. And although she kept silent, her trauma was somehow transmitted, not through words, but through unresolved emotions that traveled from generation to generation until they reached me. How is it possible for someone else's pain to live in us? That question haunted me, and the more I investigated it, the more examples I found in my own life and in the lives of others. When traumas aren't faced, they find ways to express themselves. They become a subtle language that manifests in our bodies, our dreams, our fears. I remember when my mother told me that during her childhood, she had recurring nightmares. She couldn't explain them. She just knew she felt a deep fear. A fear that wasn't connected to any particular event. Was her fear really her own? When I discovered more about my grandmother's history, I understood that those night terrors could have been a way of expressing the trauma that her mother had never verbalized. The past had, in a way, found a voice through her. This is how trauma communicates, through sensations and emotions that we don't always understand. It's a language we don't learn consciously but understand instinctively. What does the past want to tell us when it speaks through us? Sometimes the message is simple. It wants to be acknowledged, heard, freed. It wasn't easy for me to accept that trauma doesn't disappear on its own. What do we do with pain that isn't ours? That was the most difficult question I had to face, because it's not enough to ignore or suppress it. Trauma, if not addressed, will continue to speak, will continue to manifest in unexpected ways. And if we don't listen, it can become a cycle that repeats over and over. The first time I talked openly about this with my mother, it was as if something inside her was also released. We had never discussed my grandmother's pain, but when we started to talk, the silence that had filled so many years was broken, and with it, a part of the weight we were carrying. Is it possible to heal something that doesn't belong to us? Yes, it is. Because by giving it a space, by allowing the past to express itself, we begin to untie the knots that bind us to it. Every time the past speaks, we have a choice: to listen or to continue ignoring it. I chose to listen, and in that act, I found a way to free not only my family, but also myself. What language is the past using to speak to you? Pay attention to your body, your emotions, those moments of unexplained discomfort. Maybe what you feel isn't yours, but it's looking to be heard. Healing the family tree. The power of reconnecting. I've always wondered what happens when our roots are forgotten, when the bond that unites us to those who came before us weakens over time. Is it possible that the pain we don't heal in our lives is a wound that has been open for generations? I asked myself that question many times until I understood that the key to healing is not only in the present, but also in the past. Remember the first time I felt the need to look back, to understand where my family story came from. It was like a whisper, a feeling that something in my life wasn't complete. How can I move forward if I don't know where I'm coming from? The family tree isn't just a list of names. It's a map of emotions, traumas, joys, and silences that still resonate in our lives. It was during a conversation with my grandmother that I first felt that call to reconnect. We were sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by memories that hung on the walls, and I asked her about her parents, my great-grandparents. She looked at me with a mix of nostalgia and sadness, and I knew there was something there, something that hadn't been said yet. "Why is it so hard to talk about the past?" I asked. "Sometimes it's easier not to remember," she replied. "But is it possible to heal something we decide not to remember?" That was the first lesson I learned when reconnecting with my family tree. What isn't named can't be healed. And so my journey began, not only into the stories of my grandparents and great-grandparents, but also into the emotions that had been trapped in time. In every conversation, in every story, I discovered not only the events of their lives, but also the emotions that those events left behind. What wounds were left unclosed? I discovered the sadness of a grandmother who lost her brother in the war, the fear of a grandfather who lived through times of crisis, the pain of a great-grandfather who could never talk about what he saw. Those wounds that never fully healed became an echo in my life. Reconnecting with them, listening to their stories, and understanding their pain was an act of healing not only for me, but for them as well. Is it possible to heal our ancestors by giving a voice to their stories? Yes, I believe so. Because by doing so, we give them the space they never had, a place where their emotions can finally rest. Every time I delve into my family's stories, I feel that something in me also changes. How is it possible that healing the past frees us in the present? Because the emotions that aren't expressed don't disappear. They transform into patterns, into cycles that we repeat without realizing it. And by reconnecting with those roots, by looking at the family tree with new eyes, we break those cycles. I remember when I finally talked to my mother about the stories I had discovered. "I never thought about everything my grandmother had to live through," I told her. Her response was a deep sigh, as if she, too, could finally release that weight. "Maybe that's why I always felt so restless," she confessed. And in that moment, I understood that healing isn't an individual process, but a collective one. When one branch of the tree is healed, the entire tree begins to flourish. That's the power of reconnecting. It's not just about knowing the names or birth dates of our ancestors, but about understanding their emotions, their struggles, their joys. What emotions are you carrying that aren't entirely yours? Ask yourself, because by recognizing where they come from, we can choose to release them. We can choose to heal. Healing the family tree is an act of bravery because it forces us to face stories we would sometimes rather not remember. But in that bravery, we find freedom. What would happen if we all looked at our roots with compassion and love? I believe we would discover that we are much more than our own stories, that we are the sum of all the experiences that have preceded us. Today, as I write these words, I feel a deeper connection with those who came before me, not because I know every detail of their lives, but because I've allowed myself to listen to them, to feel what they felt. And by doing so, I've healed a part of myself that I didn't even know was broken. Are you willing to heal your family tree? If so, I invite you to start with a simple question. What stories in my family haven't been told yet? The soul's journey, seeking inner peace. I've always believed that the soul doesn't follow a straight path. It moves in spirals. Sometimes it goes backward, stops, gets lost. Have you ever felt that your soul is searching for something, but you don't know exactly what it is? That was a feeling that accompanied me for a long time. A constant whisper inside me that reminded me I still hadn't found the peace I so longed for. I remember one day while walking through a forest, I felt a deep connection with my own being for the first time. I had been living on autopilot, absorbed in daily worries and the expectations of others. How many times do we live without stopping to listen to what we really want? But in that instant, surrounded by nature, the noise in my mind went silent, and it was as if something bigger than me was speaking to me. What is inner peace? It's a question we ask ourselves throughout our lives, and the answer isn't always easy. I used to think that peace was a destination, a place I would reach someday. But little by little, I began to understand that peace isn't something that is found outside of us. It's hidden in the depths of our being. It's a state of connection and acceptance. The soul, I realized, is in a constant search, not because it's lost, but because it always longs to reconnect with its essence. What have we lost along the way that distances us from that peace? In my case, I discovered that the rush to meet the expectations of others had disconnected me from what was truly important. I had forgotten to listen to myself. There was a moment while I was talking to a friend when I realized how many people feel the same way. Why is it so difficult to find that inner peace amid the daily chaos? And the answer, as so often, was in the silence, in learning to listen to the soul, to give it space to express itself. We don't always know what we need, but the soul always does. Every time I stopped to reflect on my own journey, I noticed that the moments of greatest peace didn't come from external achievements or successes, but in those moments when I allowed myself to simply be. When was the last time you gave yourself permission to simply be without expectations? Over the years, I understood that the soul's journey is one of constant return to ourselves. We get sidetracked, we get lost, but there's always a call to come back and find ourselves again. How many times have you felt that your life is taking you away from who you really are? In my case, it was in those moments of greatest disconnection that I felt the most need to seek peace. And that search wasn't outward, it was inward. I remember a conversation I had with my mother when I told her about my desire to find peace. She, with her serene wisdom, said to me, "Peace isn't something you look for. It's something you cultivate within yourself." Those words resonated with me, and it was then that I understood that although my soul was on a constant journey, peace had always been there, waiting for me. Cultivating inner peace. Cultivating inner peace is a question I ask myself every day. Sometimes it's in the small moments of gratitude, in intentional pauses, in the conscious decisions not to give in to the noise of the world. Other times, it's in the acceptance that not everything can be controlled and in learning to let go of what overwhelms us. The soul's journey doesn't have a final destination, and that's what makes it so beautiful, because it's not about reaching a specific place, but about learning to be present in the process. What's preventing your peace right now? I ask myself that question when restlessness returns, and many times I discover that what distances me from peace isn't the external world, but my own resistance to accepting what is. Today, as I write this, I feel a deep gratitude for every detour, for every moment I felt lost, because it was in those moments that my soul grew the most, where I learned the most about what it truly means to find peace. The soul's journey is a constant return to ourselves, and with every step, every pause, we discover that peace never left. It was always waiting for us to come back and listen. The memory of pain. How generations connect. I've always wondered how pain can travel through time, how it's possible for what our ancestors lived through to leave invisible marks on us. Is it possible that the suffering we feel isn't entirely our own? That doubt accompanied me for years, until one day, observing my family, something clicked inside me. I realized that emotions don't know the barriers of time. Pain, if not healed, transforms into a silent inheritance that is passed down from generation to generation. I remember a conversation with my mother one ordinary day. I asked her, "Why do you always worry about the future so much?" "I don't know," she answered, but in her eyes, I saw more than her words could express. Her anxiety, her constant fear of the future weren't entirely hers. They were echoes of an untold story, a memory of pain that had been passed down through generations. How can one generation's pain affect the next? I began to research my own family, to ask difficult questions, to look closely at the silences that had always been present. And it was then that I discovered that my grandmother, her mother, had lived through a tragedy she never fully shared. She had lost her brother in tragic circumstances, and the pain of that loss had transformed into a shadow that never stopped accompanying her. My mother, although she didn't live through that loss directly, inherited the fear and anxiety that the tragedy had sown in her mother. How is it possible to inherit emotions we haven't experienced? By understanding this, I realized that our emotions aren't always the result of our own experiences. Sometimes they are the emotional responses of those who came before us, of the generations that couldn't completely heal their own pain. The body, the heart, the soul, they all have memory. Have you ever felt a pain you can't explain? That pain is often an emotional inheritance, a silent connection between the present and the past. It's as if our cells, our emotions, know something that we haven't discovered yet, and by not naming it, by not acknowledging it, we perpetuate it. When I understood this, something inside me changed. I began to see my own life from a new perspective. How much of what we feel truly belongs to our personal history? In my case, I realized that much of my own fear of loss and my anxiety about the uncertain wasn't mine. It was part of that memory, of pain that had been passed down from generation to generation, waiting to be released. Healing that pain wasn't an immediate process. How can you heal something that doesn't completely belong to you? I found the answer in reconnection and acknowledgement. By talking openly about my grandmother's story, by allowing the pain to be expressed, I felt a part of myself also being liberated. The first step to healing the memory of pain is to acknowledge it, to give it a place, because what isn't acknowledged continues to act in the shadows. I remember that after several conversations with my mother, she began to feel lighter. Perhaps now I understand where my constant worry comes from, she told me one day, and in her voice, I noticed a slight transformation. Her anxiety hadn't disappeared, but at least now she knew it wasn't entirely hers. She knew that part of what she felt was a connection to her mother's unhealed pain, and by recognizing it, she began to free herself. What emotions are you carrying that might not be yours? That's the question I ask myself every time I feel an emotion I can't explain. Because by looking back at our roots, we find answers that allow us to heal not only our own lives, but also the lives of those who came before us. Unhealed pain will always find a way to manifest until someone in the chain decides to break the cycle. Healing the memory of pain isn't easy. How do we free ourselves from an emotional legacy we didn't ask for? The key lies in compassion, in recognizing that even if we didn't live that pain directly, we have the power to release it. And by doing so, we free not only ourselves, but also future generations. The Family Mirror. Reflections of Suffering and Healing. The first time I truly understood what it means to see yourself reflected in others was during a conversation with my mother. Have you ever noticed how sometimes what bothers us most in others is what we haven't healed in ourselves? I asked her one day while we were going over an old family argument. She fell silent, and in her gaze, I saw the answer. We reflect on those we love, for better or for worse. In my family, I've seen how suffering has been reflected from one generation to another, like a mirror that never changes its image until someone decides to look closer. What do we see in the reflection of those around us? Sometimes what hurts us most about them is what hurts us most about ourselves. It's easy to point out someone else's pain, but it's harder to acknowledge that this suffering also lives within us. I remember an afternoon talking to my grandmother about her relationship with her mother. "We always fought," she told me. "She was so harsh with me, and I never understood why." Years later, when my grandmother had her first daughter, she repeated the same pattern. Why do we keep reflecting the same pain over and over, I thought. It's as if unhealed suffering seeks to repeat itself, looking for an opportunity to be seen, understood, and finally healed. What are we not seeing in the mirror of our family relationships? That question began to guide me in my own reflections. I realized that what frustrated me most about my mother, her constant worry about the future, was something I also carried in silence. How is it possible for the pain I see in her to also be a part of me? The answer, although painful, was clear. What hurts us in others is a reflection of what we still haven't healed. The family mirror not only reflects suffering, it also reflects the possibility of healing. How can we transform that reflection into something that frees us instead of trapping us? At first, it seems impossible, as if we're destined to repeat the same mistakes. But I've learned that by observing ourselves, with compassion, that same mirror can be a tool for healing. What we see in others offers us an opportunity to see ourselves more clearly. It was when I started talking to my mother about her fears that I understood how much we shared. "I don't want you to keep worrying so much," I told her once. And she replied, "That's the same thing I used to tell my mother." It was like a mirror that showed me what we both carried inside. By acknowledging it, something changed. Not immediately, but slowly. We began to see each other with more tenderness. And in that tenderness, I discovered the possibility of healing. What do the people you love reflect in you? If you stop to observe, you might discover that what bothers you, what hurts you, is a part of you that is asking to be healed. In my case, by recognizing that my constant worry was a reflection of generations of women before me, I could begin to free myself from that burden. But I didn't do it alone. I did it through the conversations, the glances, the reconciliations I had with my mother and grandmother. Healing the family mirror isn't simple. It requires the courage to face what we see. What happens when we don't like what we see in others? That's the moment we must ask ourselves if we are ready to heal that part of ourselves. It's not about changing others, but about transforming the relationship we have with our own pain. The power of forgiveness, healing broken relationships. I've always thought that forgiveness is one of the most powerful yet difficult forces to understand. Why is it so hard for us to forgive, even when we know it's what's best for our heart? That question has accompanied me for years. Every time I felt a relationship break, every time resentment weighed more than love. I remember once as a child watching my parents argue. It wasn't a particularly serious argument, but something in the atmosphere changed. I felt a space open between them, a void that, although small, was perceptible. How can a small wound create such a great distance? Over time, that wound didn't heal immediately. Resentments accumulate like fallen leaves on the ground, and if they're not gathered, they create layers that hide what was once alive and flourishing. I didn't understand the power of forgiveness until much later, when it was me who felt the need to forgive and be forgiven. What happens when we hold on to pain instead of releasing it? At first, it seems like the pain protects us. We think that by staying angry, we're creating a barrier that protects us from harm. But over time, we discover that resentment isn't a shield, but a prison. How do we learn to forgive? That was the question I asked myself when I felt a close relationship breaking. It hurt me deeply because deep down, I knew the only way to heal wasn't through more hurtful words or silent distances, but through forgiveness. But how do you forgive when everything inside you resists it? It was my grandmother who, without knowing it, taught me the power of forgiveness. She and her sister didn't speak for years because of a misunderstanding that, over time, became a wall between them. Why? Do we let small conflicts grow into unbreakable barriers? It was in her last years that my grandmother decided to break that wall. "I don't want to carry this splinter anymore," she told me one day. And although at first her sister didn't accept her apology, over time something changed. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't something you do for others. It's something you do for yourself. What do we release when we forgive? We release the weight of pain. We release the hope that things could have been different. When my grandmother and her sister finally reconciled, it was as if a light was turned on in their eyes again. They had not only healed their relationship, but by forgiving each other, they also freed themselves from years of resentment that had kept them captive. When I think about my own relationships, about those that have been broken by unspoken words or unhealed wounds, I wonder if forgiveness could be the key to restoring them. Is it possible for forgiveness to heal even what seems irreparable? I believe so, because forgiveness doesn't depend on the other person changing or apologizing. It depends on our ability to release the pain and allow love to take its place. I remember a conversation I had with my mother shortly after we had a big argument. "Why is it so hard for us to forgive each other?" I asked her. Her answer was sincere and direct. "Because sometimes it hurts us more to accept that we're hurt than to continue feeding the resentment." In that moment, I understood that forgiveness wasn't just an act of liberation for the other person, but also for ourselves. What relationships in your life are waiting to be healed by forgiveness? Maybe you've wondered how to take that step. How to open your heart without feeling you're exposing yourself to pain again. But in my experience, the act of forgiving isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It's recognizing that the pain no longer has power over you, that you have decided to let it go and walk toward freedom. The power of forgiveness lies in its ability to transform. By forgiving, we're not saying that what happened was okay, nor are we minimizing the pain we felt. What we're doing is choosing not to let that pain define our lives or our relationships. What could you gain if you decided to forgive today? By asking myself this question, I realized that in the end, what I gained most was peace, a peace that only comes when you let go of the chains of resentment. The echoes of silence, untold stories. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Have you ever stopped to listen to what isn't being said? In my family, silences have always been a language in themselves, loaded with stories that were never told, with emotions that were hidden behind evasive glances and incomplete gestures. At first, I didn't understand how powerful silence can be until I started to notice how those echoes didn't disappear. They kept resonating in our lives. I remember family gatherings when I was a child, the conversations that started with enthusiasm and then suddenly died down in the middle of an awkward pause. Why do we always avoid certain topics? That was the question I asked myself, not knowing then that pain often finds refuge in silence. It was my grandmother who taught me, although without realizing it, that silence isn't empty. Silence holds secrets. She used to tell me in a joking tone, but behind those words hid a much deeper truth. She, like so many women of her generation, carried stories she never shared. How much of what we don't say becomes a shadow that accompanies us? As I grew older, I started to notice that there were patterns that repeated in my family, emotions that we all shared but that no one seemed to be able to name. It was as if silence had become a kind of unspoken pact between us. What stories haven't been told in your family life? By asking myself that question, I realized that silence can also be a way of protecting ourselves, of avoiding reliving a pain we don't know how to face. But what about what's not told? Can silence carry more weight than words? I discovered that, yes, it can. Secrets, untold stories, create echoes that resonate in our relationships, in our decisions, in our way of seeing the world, and even if we try to ignore them, they're still there, waiting to be heard, waiting to find a way out. Once, while talking to my mother about her childhood, I noticed that she avoided mentioning certain details about her father. "What happened with Grandpa?" I asked her one day. She was quiet for a moment, and her response was as brief as it was definitive. "There are some things it's better not to talk about." In that instant, I understood that silence can also be a refuge from the fear and pain we don't know how to process. But at the same time, I knew that the stories that aren't told never disappear. They simply find another way to manifest. What are we hiding behind the silences? That question began to follow me, and I started looking for the answers. In the unspoken gestures, in the glances that avoided confronting the past. It was then that I understood that to break the patterns that bind us, we must first listen to what silence is trying to tell us. Because even if certain topics aren't talked about, their consequences are felt, and by ignoring them, we only perpetuate a cycle of suffering that is passed down from generation to generation. I remember once when my grandmother finally told me a story she had kept in silence for years. It wasn't easy for her. I saw it in her eyes, in the way her hands trembled as she relived those memories. But in the end, when she finished, something in the air changed. Is it possible that untold stories keep us captive? It is, and in that moment, I knew that by giving a voice to what had been hidden, my grandmother not only freed herself, but also freed all of us. The echoes of silence are powerful. They speak to us. They show us what we need to face so we can heal. What would happen if you decided to listen to the untold stories in your family? Sometimes all we need is to open a space for those stories to find their place, so that what has been in the shadows can see the light. Being reborn from fear. Personal. Transformation? I've always felt that fear has two sides, one that paralyzes us, stops us, and whispers in our ear that we're not capable, and another more hidden one that invites us to transform ourselves, to discover strengths we didn't even know we had. What happens when we decide to face fear instead of running from it? I asked myself that question again and again. It wasn't until I experienced my own rebirth from fear that I understood its transformative power. I remember a specific moment in my life when fear trapped me. It was an irrational, almost invisible fear, but I felt it entangle itself in every decision I made. Why does fear have so much influence in our lives? Because it's an ancient force, rooted in the depths of our being, designed to protect us. But it's also a force that, if we don't learn to manage it, limits us, locks us in invisible cages that we build ourselves. For months, I lived in that cage. Every decision I made was tinged with fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being enough. Have you ever felt that fear dictates the course of your life? In those moments, I felt like I was losing myself, that I had forgotten who I really was. It was then that I realized that if I didn't face that fear, I could never transform myself. I could never be reborn. How do you face fear? The answer, I discovered, isn't in trying to eliminate it, but in learning to walk with it. Instead of continuing to run away, I decided to take a step toward it. It was a small but decisive step. Every day, I pushed myself to do something that scared me, something that would shake me out of my comfort zone, and with every step, something inside me began to change. Is it possible for fear to be a teacher in disguise? Yes, it is. Because in that process of facing my fears, I discovered a part of me I didn't know, a stronger, more resilient, more authentic part. Fear, instead of being my enemy, became my ally, showing me the areas of my life that needed to be transformed. What areas of your life could be transformed if you decided to face your fears? Being reborn from fear isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, sometimes slow and painful, but profoundly liberating. Every time I took a step toward what scared me, I felt a layer of fear vanish, as if I were peeling an onion, little by little getting to the center, to the true me that had been hidden behind so many layers of insecurity. I remember a specific moment when I felt that rebirth more deeply. I was in a situation that months earlier would have paralyzed me with fear. But in that instant, something inside me changed. I no longer felt the same fear. Instead, I felt a calmness, an inner strength I had never felt before. Is it possible for fear to disappear when we face it? I asked myself, and the answer was clear. It doesn't completely disappear, but it loses its power over us. What would your life be like if fear no longer dictated your decisions? I ask myself that question every day, because every day is an opportunity to be reborn, to continue transforming myself from fear. I learned that fear doesn't have to be a barrier. It can be a door that leads us to discover parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. And in that confrontation, we find a strength we didn't even know we had. I remember talking to my mother about this process. I've always been afraid to make big decisions, I confessed to her. With her quiet wisdom, she told me, fear is part of life, but it shouldn't be the one that directs it. Her words resonated deeply with me because fear, although it will always be present, doesn't have to be the one at the helm of our lives. What changes could happen in your life if you decided to walk toward your fear? That's the question I asked myself every time I felt that familiar sense of dread. And each time, I realized that behind fear was an opportunity to be reborn, to leave behind the old versions of myself that no longer served me. Crossing emotional borders. From darkness to light, I've always felt that inside us there are invisible borders, lines that separate us from ourselves and from our deepest emotions. What happens when we cross those borders? I asked myself many times. Are we waiting for something beyond what we think we know? Or perhaps rather, are we facing a darkness we're afraid to explore? But how can we get to the light if we don't first go through the darkness? I remember a specific moment in my life, an instant when everything seemed to fall apart. Life, as it so often does, pushed me into a dark place, full of doubts and fears. I thought I had overcome. Why does it seem that our most intense emotions appear at the moments we least expect them? The answer, with time, I found in that same darkness. At first, I didn't want to cross that emotional border. I was scared of what I might find. What emotions do we hide behind the walls we build to protect ourselves? I asked myself. But life, wise in its way of guiding us, gave me no other option. I came face to face with my own limits, with the emotions I had avoided for so long. Fear, sadness, hopelessness. They all presented themselves to me as guardians of an unknown territory. What does it feel like to cross those borders? At first, it hurts. It hurts because every step toward what scares us feels like a betrayal of the security we've built. But at the same time, with every step, the burden becomes a little lighter, and it's then that you begin to see that darkness isn't the end of the road, but the threshold to something new. One night, while meditating on everything I was feeling, I realized that the true border I needed to cross wasn't outside but inside me. How many times do we get trapped in our own minds, unable to cross into healing? That was the most difficult border I had to cross. That of my own limiting beliefs, of my most deeply rooted fears. It was a slow process, but in that crossing, I began to feel something I didn't expect: liberation. Is it possible that by facing our darkness, we discover a light we've never seen before? It is, because when we decide to face what scares us, what makes us uncomfortable, we discover that the power those emotions have over us begins to fade. I remember talking to a friend about this, and she confessed that she had spent years avoiding her own feelings of sadness. I don't want to feel more pain, she told me. And I understood her because I had also been there, in that denial, in that resistance to crossing the emotional border that separates pain from healing. But what we don't realize is that by avoiding those emotions, we only prolong our stay in the darkness. How can we heal if we don't allow ourselves to feel? By crossing those emotional borders, I began to discover a version of myself I didn't know, a more authentic, more connected version of my truth. What version of yourself is waiting on the other side of your fears? That's the question I ask myself every time I feel I'm at a new border, because I know that behind every fear, behind every intense emotion, there's a part of me that is ready to be reborn. Today, as I look back on my path, I see how every step I took into the unknown brought me closer to the light. Darkness isn't the enemy. It's the door to our transformation. And by crossing that door, we realize that the light has always been there, waiting for us on the other side. The wisdom of trauma. I've always believed that trauma has a particular way of hiding in the deepest corners of our family history, only to reveal itself at the most unexpected moments. Is it possible for trauma to teach us something? I asked myself again and again, trying to make sense of that pain that seemed not to belong to me entirely, but that somehow lived in me. I remember the day I discovered that trauma is not only individual but also collective. I was in a conversation with my mother, who was telling me for the first time details about my grandmother's life, details she had never mentioned before. "Why have we never talked about these things?" I asked, surprised by the intensity of what she was revealing to me. Her response was simple but full of meaning. Because sometimes the pain is so great that we don't know how to put it into words. Thus, I understood that trauma is not just something we live personally, but something we inherit from those who came before us. How can trauma travel from one generation to another? That question began to guide my reflections, and the more I observed my own life, the more I saw the invisible threads that connected my history to my mother's and my mother's to my grandmother's. Trauma, although painful, brings with it a unique wisdom. What can we learn from pain that isn't ours but that we feel deeply? That was one of the most difficult lessons to accept, because when trauma manifests, we often see it as a burden, something we would want to avoid at all costs. But what would happen if we decided to look at it directly? If we allowed it to teach us something about ourselves, about our family, about our humanity? It was in that process of exploration that I discovered that trauma isn't just a legacy of pain. It's also a legacy of survival, of strength, of resilience. How is it possible for something so destructive to also contain the seed of transformation? I realized that although trauma can break us, it can also be the door to a profound wisdom, a wisdom that, if we decide to listen, allows us not only to heal, but also to grow. I remember a particular day when I talked to my mother about her own relationship with trauma. "Have you ever wondered if what you feel comes from something bigger than your own experience?" I said to her. She was silent, and in that moment, I knew there was something in her memories, in her life, that she still hadn't fully processed. "I've felt many things that I don't know where they come from," she confessed to me. And it was then that I understood. That part of our mission is to unravel those emotional threads that connect us to the past. Is it possible to release inherited trauma? The answer, at least for me, is not so simple. We can't erase what has already happened, but we can learn to live with it in a different way, to transform that pain into wisdom, into compassion, into a greater understanding of who we are and where we come from. What would happen if we could see trauma as a teacher instead of an enemy? By opening myself to this possibility, I began to feel a new lightness inside me, not because the trauma disappeared, but because by ceasing to resist it, I found a way to integrate it into my life in a healthier way. Trauma marks us, but it doesn't have to define us. That was the most important lesson I inherited from my family, that although pain has been part of our history, so has the ability to overcome it, to adapt, to move forward. Today, as I reflect on everything I've learned, I realize that inherited trauma isn't just a burden. It's also a bridge that connects us to past generations, that reminds us that we're not alone in our pain. What part of you could heal if you decided to listen to the lessons that trauma has to offer you? The art of facing the past, freeing yourself from the cycle. I've always felt that the past, although seemingly distant, has a silent way of remaining present in our lives. What happens when we don't face what we've left behind? I asked myself again and again. The past, when it's not looked at directly, becomes an endless cycle that envelops us and pulls us back over and over into the same mistakes, the same pains. Remember a conversation I had with my mother one summer afternoon as we watched the sunset from her kitchen window. I asked her about her childhood, about those moments that had never been mentioned. Her silence was the first answer. "Why do we avoid talking about the past?" I insisted. Finally, with a deep sigh, she began to tell me stories she had kept for years, stories that, in a way, had always been present even if they had never been spoken aloud. Listening to her, I realized how much of our current life is built on the experiences we've chosen not to face. How many times does the unresolved pain of the past manifest in our present behaviors? It was in that moment that I understood that facing the past isn't just a way to heal, but a way to free yourself from the repetitive cycle that keeps us trapped in family, emotional, and personal patterns. How do we face the past? I asked myself, knowing it's not an easy task. Looking back, reliving what hurts us, can seem overwhelming. However, the more we avoid that confrontation, the more power we give the past over our present. Every time we ignore those memories, those unresolved emotions, we allow them to continue, to influence our decisions, our relationships, our way of seeing the world. There was a particular day when I decided to face my own past. I was tired of repeating the same mistakes, of feeling that something in me was trapped. What part of me is still living in the past? I asked myself as I observed my emotional patterns, my reactions, my fears. At first, it was difficult. I felt that every step toward those memories was just a reminder of what had hurt me. But little by little, I began to see something different. The past, if we face it with courage, loses the power to define us. Is it possible to free yourself from family cycles, from inherited wounds, from unresolved traumas? The answer, at least for me, was yes. But not because the past disappears, but because by looking at it directly, we strip it of its power over us. I remember a conversation with my grandmother in which we talked about the decisions she had made in her life. She confessed that many of them had been guided by fear, by pain she had never resolved. Sometimes we avoid facing what hurts us most because we believe that by ignoring it, it will disappear, she told me. But as she herself discovered over time, what we don't face only grows in the shadows. What would happen if you decided to face the past? That's the question I ask myself every time I feel that something in me is trapped in a repetitive cycle. And each time I discover that by looking back with compassion and without judgment, I find the freedom I have sought for so long. Facing the past is an art. It's not about reliving the pain, but about looking at it with new eyes, with the wisdom that only time gives us. How would your life change if you decided to let go of the ghosts of the past? In my case, by doing so, I found a new version of myself, a version that isn't defined by what happened, but by what I've learned from it. The weight of memories, how they influence our present. I've always thought that memories are like shadows that dance in the corners of our minds, persistent and sometimes unbearable. Have you ever felt that some memories weigh more than others? That they drag you down when you try to get up? That's a feeling that has accompanied me throughout my life, an invisible burden that at times seemed unbreakable. I remember a quiet afternoon at my grandparents' house, sitting on the porch as the sun began to set. The gentle breeze brought with it the scent of flowers, but also awakened fragments of memories I had long forgotten. Why do certain memories resurface at the most unexpected moments? I asked myself. It was as if my mind chose those instants to remind me of things I had never finished processing. In that moment, I watched my grandfather reminiscing about stories from his youth, stories full of laughter and also of losses. How do these unresolved memories affect those around us? I thought. I noticed how his face darkened when he spoke of certain events, as if a part of him was still trapped in those moments of the past. It was then that I understood that memories don't just define us. They also shape our current emotions and behaviors. Is it possible that memories aren't just memories but also active influences in our present life? Yes. And it took me time to understand that by not facing those memories, we allow them to direct our actions and decisions without us even realizing it. Every unresolved memory is like a stone that weighs us down, making it difficult for us to move toward peace and happiness. There was a time in my life when I felt stuck, as if I were trapped in an endless cycle of anxiety and sadness. How do you break a cycle that seems to perpetuate itself? The answer, although painful, was in the memories I avoided facing. I decided then that it was time to look at those memories directly, to understand how they influenced my present and, ultimately, my future. I began to keep a journal, recording every memory that emerged, every emotion that accompanied it. What would happen if you started documenting your memories to better understand their impact? It was a powerful tool. By writing, I could see patterns, identify how certain events from the past influenced my current reactions. Can you see connections between your past experiences and your present well-being? Yes. And by recognizing those connections, I began to feel that I could free myself from their weight. I remember a deep conversation with a friend where we shared our most painful memories. Is it possible that by sharing our memories we can lighten their burden? Absolutely. By opening up to her, I not only felt understood but also liberated. What happens when we allow others to know our darkest memories? We discover that we're not alone in our suffering, that sharing can be an act of healing for both the one who speaks and the one who listens. How can you transform the weight of memories into a force for change? By facing and understanding our memories, we can reinterpret them, learn from them, and finally free ourselves from their negative influence. Every memory we process is a step toward a more free and conscious life. What lessons can you extract from your memories to improve your present? We can learn to manage our emotions, to break destructive patterns, and to build healthier relationships. In a therapy session, I asked my therapist, "How can I free myself from the memories that tie me to the past?" Her response was simple but profound. It's not about forgetting, but about integrating those memories into your personal story in a way that empowers you, not limits you. And so I learned that the memory of pain doesn't have to be a chain that keeps us captive, but a tool that guides us toward a greater understanding and personal growth. What happens when you decide to face and transform your memories? You discover an inner strength you didn't know you had, a resilience that allows you to navigate life with more clarity and purpose. By releasing the weight of memories, you allow yourself to be reborn like a flower that opens to the sun after a long night. Today, as I write these words, I feel a lightness I didn't know before. It's the freedom of having faced my memories, of having transformed pain into wisdom. What memories are you ready to face today? That's the question I ask myself every time I feel that the weight of memories threatens to crumble me. And each time I remind myself that I have the power to free myself, to heal, and to be reborn. This chapter is an invitation to look at your own memories with compassion and curiosity. The weight of memories can be overwhelming, but it's also the key to freeing yourself from the cycle of pain. Allow yourself to remember by allowing yourself to heal and discover how every memory can be a life lesson, an opportunity to grow and transform your present. Paths to healing. The search for answers. Throughout my life, I've felt that healing isn't a destination we reach, but a path we walk. Have you ever felt that the answers you're looking for aren't outside of you, but within your own journey? That was a lesson I learned slowly, as I sought to heal the wounds that life had left inside me. At first, I believed that healing would come, in the form of clear answers, of immediate solutions, but over time I discovered that true healing is found in the search itself. I remember a particular moment when I felt that emotional pain had brought me to the edge of my own capabilities. What do we do when wounds seem too deep to heal? I found myself sitting in my room, surrounded by questions, feeling that the weight of what I carried inside had no way out. But then a small voice inside me whispered, "Keep searching." And it was that little whisper that pushed me to get up, to continue. How do we begin to search for answers when we don't know where to start? For me, the first step was to recognize that I didn't have all the answers and that was okay. The search for healing isn't about having everything clear, but about being willing to walk in uncertainty with the faith that little by little, the answers will reveal themselves. I started by listening to myself, by giving my emotions space without judging them. I discovered that the simple act of being present with myself was a first step toward healing. Throughout my journey, I realized that each person has their own healing process. How can the search for answers be different for each of us? By sharing my experience with others, I understood that some find healing in nature, others in meditation, in therapy, in writing, or even in silence. What path to healing resonates with you? That question accompanied me as I continued to search for my own path. I remember a trip I took, one that changed my perspective completely. I was walking alone through a forest, with my heart full of questions. Where are the answers we're looking for so much? As I walked, I felt that the landscape around me reflected my own internal process. The tall trees, the tangled roots, the fresh air. Everything seemed to speak to me of patience, of stillness, of the need to allow the answers to come in their own time. What happens when we stop pushing for immediate answers? In that moment, I understood that the answers don't always come when we want them, but when we're ready to receive them. What do we need to let go of to allow healing to take place? For me, the biggest obstacle in my search was my resistance to letting go of control. I wanted to understand everything. I wanted everything to make sense, but I realized that true healing doesn't have a fixed roadmap. It's a fluid process that requires surrender, trust, and above all, openness to the unknown. Talking to close people helped me understand that healing isn't linear. My mother, in one of our many conversations, told me, healing doesn't mean erasing what hurts us. It means learning to live with it in a different way. Her words resonated deeply with me. Is it possible to find answers within our own scars? I began to see that my wounds weren't just sources of pain, but also doors to a new understanding of myself, of my limits, of my strength. As I continued walking on the path of healing, I realized something beautiful. I wasn't alone in my search. How many times do we feel alone in our pain, without realizing that we're all looking for something? Every person I met along my journey was on their own path, each with their questions, their fears, their wounds, and in that connection, I found a new way of healing. Through empathy, mutual support, the understanding that the search is universal. Today, as I reflect on everything I've lived, I know that healing isn't something that's reached once and for all. Is it possible that true healing is a continuous dance between pain and hope? Yes, because every time we face a new challenge, we realize that we're still learning, we're still healing, and that's okay. The search for answers isn't a race, it's a journey full of curves, pauses, and unexpected discoveries. Between science and the soul. The impact of generational trauma. I've always felt there's a constant dance between science and the soul, especially when we talk about trauma. How can something as intangible as emotional pain so deeply affect our body, our mind, and even those around us? I asked myself. Over time, I discovered that trauma isn't just a personal experience, but is transmitted like an unwanted inheritance, from generation to generation. And although we often don't fully understand it, its effects are felt deeply. I remember a conversation I had with a friend who's a doctor, in which he told me about something I was unaware of. Trauma can leave scars not only on our emotions but on our DNA, he told me. I was surprised. How is it possible for the trauma we experience to cross such deep barriers and touch generations that haven't even been born yet? It was then that I began to understand the term generational trauma, not only from an emotional point of view but also from a scientific one. Science tells us that trauma can alter the way our genes are expressed, affecting not only our physical health but also the emotional health of our descendants. Is it possible that the unhealed wounds of our ancestors live in us? This question led me to explore beyond the visible, beyond what I could understand from my personal experience. And the more I researched, the clearer it became that trauma doesn't end with us. It continues its course, seeking a way out, a relief. Listening to family stories, both in my own life and in others, I noticed a pattern. How many times does the pain we feel today reflect the pain of those who came before us? I saw how the fear my mother carried wasn't just hers. There was something deeper, a sense of insecurity that seemed to come from a story that had never been fully told. Could her anxiety be connected to the losses and struggles that her own parents had lived through? What I learned is that generational trauma isn't just a chain of pain, but also an unconscious search for healing. How can the soul find relief if we don't understand the origin of our pain? By beginning to look beyond my own experiences, I saw how science and the soul intertwined, forming a bridge between what we feel and what we inherit. But despite the scientific explanations, I felt that trauma also had a spiritual component, something that couldn't be explained only with theories or studies. What happens to the soul when the wounds of previous generations aren't healed? I felt that those wounds found ways to express themselves, whether through unexplained emotions, illnesses that seemed to come out of nowhere, or repetitive patterns we couldn't break. One day, while talking to my grandmother about her childhood, she told me a story she had never mentioned before. She told me about a loss that had marked her family deeply, and as she spoke, I saw something in her eyes that she couldn't express in words. How do we carry within us the stories that were never told? I asked her, and in her silence, I found my answer. There are things that are transmitted not through words, but through the soul itself, through unspoken emotions, prolonged silences, and glances that avoid certain truths. Is it possible to break the cycle of generational trauma? I asked myself for years, and although I don't have a definitive answer, I've come to believe that it is, but only if we're willing to face the past with courage. By knowing our roots, by listening to the stories that precede us, we can begin to heal not only our own wounds, but also those of those who came before us. What would happen if we started talking about what has never been said? Today, I know that trauma doesn't disappear on its own. It requires work, intention, and above all, love. How do we heal what we can't see but feel so deeply? We heal by looking inward, by recognizing that we're not just the product of our own experiences, but also from the experiences of those who came before us. And when we do, something within us is liberated. The connection with our ancestors, roots and paths. I've always felt that our lives are like paths that intertwine with those of those who came before us. What role do our ancestors play in the decisions we make today? I asked myself from a very young age. It's not always obvious, but as we grow, we begin to realize that our roots, invisible to the naked eye, support us with every step we take. Remember a day when my grandmother showed me an old family album. The pages were worn with time, but the stories they contained were still alive. Who were these people who lived long before I came into the world? I asked myself as I turned the pages. My grandmother smiled as if she understood the depth of my questions and told me something I will never forget. They are part of you even if you never knew them. Their decisions, their pains, their joys, everything is in your veins. How can we feel the connection with our ancestors in a world so far from their times? That question has accompanied me in many moments of my life. We live in an era of constant speed and change, where the past seems to be relegated to the shadows. However, the more I stopped to listen to those family stories, the clearer it became to me that the past isn't as far away as we think. Our roots aren't simply part of an ancient story. They are the foundation upon which we build our lives, our relationships, our dreams. What happens when we lose the connection with our roots? I asked myself. By moving away from family stories for a while, I began to feel disconnected, as if something inside me wasn't complete. It was then that I understood that we can't move forward in life without knowing where we come from. The paths we follow today are, in many ways, guided by the paths that were already traveled by our ancestors. 1. Quiet afternoon. I decided to research my roots more, to learn about the paths my grandparents and great-grandparents had taken. Every story I discovered, every detail of their lives, made me see how connected we are to their decisions, how much of who we are today is the result of the choices they made. The answer became something evident. We are the continuation of their paths, the echo of their steps, even if we often don't know it. One night, talking with my mother, I asked her if she had ever felt the presence of her own ancestors in her decisions. She looked at me in surprise, as if she had never thought about it before, but after a moment of reflection, she told me, "Sometimes I feel that what I do isn't just for me, but for them too, to honor what they lived and what they gave me." That answer resonated deeply with me. How can we honor our ancestors through our daily actions? The connection with our ancestors isn't just about remembering names or important dates, but about understanding that what they lived still has an impact on us. Their struggles, their dreams, their achievements, all are part of our emotional and spiritual DNA. Is it possible for the legacy of our ancestors to guide us even without us realizing it? Yes, it is. Every decision we make can be influenced by the wisdom and knowledge they have passed down to us, even if we never heard it directly. How can we reconnect with our roots in this modern world? For me, the answer is in the pause, in the silence, in those moments when we allow ourselves to listen to what the soul whispers to us. By reconnecting with our roots, we also find paths to the future. We realize that we're not alone on our journey. We carry within us the strength and wisdom of past generations. Today, as I reflect on the life I lead, I feel that every step I take is part of a larger path. A path that began long before my time and will continue long after. What part of you comes from those ancestors you never knew but who live within you? Every time I ask myself that, I find answers in the small details of my life, in my passions, in my fears, in my dreams. Everything is interconnected. Everything has a root that nourishes us, even if we don't always see it. How to break family patterns. I've always believed that our family stories are like interwoven threads, forming a tapestry that we sometimes feel we can't change. Is it possible to rewrite the history that has been woven by generations? I asked myself over and over as I observed the dynamics that repeated in my own family. At first, it seemed like an impossible task, but over time, I discovered that breaking family patterns is not only possible, but necessary to heal. I remember a time when, talking with my mother, she mentioned how she had noticed that certain reactions she had were the same ones she had seen in her mother. "Why do we repeat the same patterns that hurt us so much?" I asked her, and her answer was as honest as it was disconcerting. "It's easier to follow what we know than to venture into the unknown." That phrase resonated deeply with me, because even if those patterns cause us pain, they are part of what we've learned, of what we were taught about love, life, and relationships. How can we break the cycles that we feel tie us down? This was the question that began to guide my life. I didn't want to repeat the same stories. I didn't want to keep walking on the same paths that had already caused deep wounds in previous generations. But at the same time, I realized how difficult it was to change, how easy it was to fall back into the same habits and responses. One day, while reading a book on family psychology, I came across a phrase that changed me. Rewriting family history begins with the conscious act of observing without judgment. At first, I didn't fully understand what it meant. But then I realized that the first step to breaking family patterns is to recognize them, to see them with clarity. How many of our behaviors are influenced by the unresolved stories of our family? By asking myself that question, I began to notice how certain automatic reactions weren't just mine, but echoes of previous generations. I remember an argument I had with my sister, one of those arguments that seemed to have no solution. It was in the middle of that conversation that I felt something inside me awaken. Am I perpetuating a family dynamic that I've seen repeat for years? In that moment, I decided to stop, breathe, and react differently. It was a small change, but it meant a lot, because by consciously deciding not to follow the same path, I was opening a new door. What small decisions could we make today to begin to change our family history? What happens when we decide to rewrite the story that has been told to us? We free ourselves, because rewriting doesn't mean erasing the past. It means giving it a new meaning, a new ending. Every time I choose to act in a different way than my ancestors did, I am honoring their history but also choosing not to repeat their pain. Is it possible to honor our roots without being tied to them? Yes, and that's the art of rewriting the story, finding the wisdom in what was but allowing yourself to create something new. One day, in a conversation with my grandmother, I asked her if she had ever felt the need to change the family dynamics she had lived. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and tenderness and told me, "In my time, I didn't know I could do it. I didn't know I had that option." Her answer made me realize how lucky we are to have the awareness and the tools to break those patterns. How many of our ancestors would have changed their lives if they had known they could? How do we start rewriting our family history? First, by recognizing that we are not condemned to repeat it. Every decision we make today, every small choice, is an opportunity to change the course of our life and that of future generations. By rewriting our history, we not only free ourselves, but also free our descendants from the burdens we have carried for so long. Today, as I reflect on this path, I feel a deep gratitude for the generations that preceded me. What legacy do we want to leave to those who come after us? By rewriting our story, we are giving future generations the opportunity to live free from the patterns that tied us down. We are creating a new future, one full of possibilities, freedom, and healing. Freeing yourself from the family burden. There are moments in life when we feel a weight that we can't understand. It's as if, without knowing why, we're carrying something that doesn't completely belong to us. Have you ever felt that you're carrying a pain that isn't entirely yours? I constantly ask myself, especially on those days when emotions seem to overflow for no apparent reason. I remember a conversation I had with my mother in which I mentioned that I sometimes felt trapped in a sadness I couldn't explain. She looked at me with a mixture of tenderness and concern and told me, "That sadness isn't just yours. At first, I didn't understand her words, but over time I began to discover what she was trying to tell me. The pain I carried inside wasn't completely mine. It was a silent inheritance, an echo of the experiences and sufferings of the generations that preceded me. How is it possible that we carry our family's pain without realizing it? I began to notice that feelings of anguish, fear, and even guilt didn't always come from my own experiences. There was something deeper, older, that moved inside me. It was then that I started to research generational trauma, and everything began to make sense. Is it possible that the pain of our ancestors lives in us? I asked myself more and more. And the answer was clear. Yes, it's possible, but it doesn't have to continue to define us. One day I decided it was time to free myself from that weight. How can we free ourselves from a burden that doesn't belong to us? The first step was to acknowledge it, to understand that what I felt wasn't just mine. It was a relief, but also a responsibility. What do I do with this pain that doesn't belong to me? I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it would disappear on its own. I had to face it, not with the intention of getting rid of it, but of understanding it and transforming it. I remember reading once that the unresolved emotions of our ancestors can manifest in our lives, waiting to be healed. What part of your life is reflecting the unhealed pain of your family? I asked myself, and little by little I began to see how certain patterns in my relationships, in my fears, and in my reactions were connected to stories that weren't even mine. Stories of losses, pains, and silences that had been passed down from generation to generation without being resolved. Is it possible to heal what we haven't lived directly? At first it seemed like an impossible task, but over time I discovered that yes, we can do it. By giving a voice to that pain, by acknowledging it, we begin to free ourselves from its power over us. It's not a quick or easy process, but it's profoundly liberating. What would happen if you decided to stop carrying the weight that doesn't belong to you? I felt that with every reflection, with every conversation about my family past, a part of me was lightening. Once, talking with my grandmother about her experiences, she confessed that she had never shared certain parts of her life because she thought they no longer mattered. "What's past is past," she used to say. But I knew, and she knew too, that stories, even if they aren't told, still live in us. What happens when untold stories continue to resonate in our lives? Those stories are looking for a way out. They're looking to be heard and finally released. How do we free ourselves from inherited pain? By listening to my grandmother, I understood that the first step is to recognize that we're not responsible for what happened before us, but we do have the responsibility to heal, to not perpetuate that pain in our lives and in future generations. By doing so, we not only free ourselves, but also those who came before and those who will come after. Today, as I write these words, I feel a peace that wasn't always present in my life. What part of you is ready to be freed from a burden that doesn't belong to it? That question accompanies me every time I feel an old pain trying to reappear, because in the end, the pain isn't mine, not completely, and by understanding that, I can decide what to do with it. Dialogue with our ancestors. I've always felt that in the quietest moments of life, there are voices that speak to us from a distant place. Is it possible that the echoes of the past still whisper in our ears? I often wondered. Sometimes it's in the murmur of a quiet afternoon or in the song of the wind that we can hear what wasn't said, what was left in the air, waiting to be discovered. I remember one particular afternoon when, sitting by the fireplace, I felt a connection to something beyond my immediate understanding. What do those who came before us want to tell us? It was as if my ancestors, those whose stories I never got to fully know, were trying to communicate something that was still pending, something that hadn't been closed. My grandmother used to say that the dead don't leave entirely. that they continue to accompany us in some way. How is it possible that those who are no longer physically here are still present in our lives? I asked her once. She, with her silent wisdom, answered me. Their voices are in you, in your decisions, in your deepest thoughts. They don't leave because they are part of who you are. In that moment, I understood that the connection with our ancestors isn't a dialogue that is broken by death, but one that continues, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes more clearly. How can we dialogue with our ancestors? That question followed me for a long time, until I began to discover that the dialogue doesn't always happen in words. Sometimes it's through sensations, intuitions, through that internal certainty that guides us without knowing exactly where it comes from. It was then that I realized that every time I faced an important decision or a moment of uncertainty, I felt as if something inside me, something ancient, was whispering the answer to me. Is it possible that the past offers us the answers we need in the present? In a conversation with my mother, I told her about this feeling of being guided by something bigger, something that came from beyond my own life. Sometimes I feel that I'm not making decisions alone, I told her. She looked at me with a melancholic smile and replied, maybe you're not. Maybe our ancestors guide us in ways we can't see, but that we can feel. How can we hear the voices of the past more clearly? I asked myself then. The answer I found was simple, although not always easy. We need to stop, to silence the noise of daily life, and to be present with what arises. In those moments of calm, the dialogue with our ancestors doesn't happen in the middle of chaos, but in the stillness, in the opening of our heart to what we can't completely control or understand. One day, while walking alone through a forest, I felt that connection stronger than ever. What happens when we listen to what the past has to say to us? I felt that I wasn't alone on my path, that the voices of those who preceded me were there, accompanying me, guiding me. It wasn't a direct dialogue. There were no spoken words, but there was a certainty, a sense of unconditional support, of ancestral wisdom that enveloped me. What could we learn if we allowed ourselves to listen more attentively? By connecting with the untold stories of our ancestors, by opening ourselves to their experiences, we find in them the keys to better understanding who we are today. Because although each of us walks our own path, we do so with the footprints of those who came before us marked on our skin. The courage to look back. Facing personal history. I've always been amazed at how the past can remain present in our lives, like a constant echo that refuses to disappear. Why is it so difficult to look back and face what we left in the shadows? I often wondered. Sometimes the past seems so distant that we believe it has no power over us, but in reality, its footprints are present in every decision, in every unresolved emotion. I remember a key moment in my life when I realized that I couldn't continue to ignore my own history. There were things I preferred to forget, things I had buried so deeply that I thought they would never surface again. What drives us to hide parts of our personal history? Fear, without a doubt. Fear of reliving the pain, of facing our own wounds. Fear that looking back will be too painful. But what we don't understand is that by avoiding our history, we continue to drag the same chains that tie us down. One day, talking with a friend, I realized that I was carrying a wound that had never healed. Have you ever felt trapped by something you thought you had overcome? I asked her. Her response was a simple nod. We both knew there were things in our lives that we avoided facing, that we preferred to leave in oblivion, but oblivion isn't a solution. It's just a pause. The past always finds a way to come back to us. How do we find the courage to look back? I constantly asked myself. For me, the answer didn't come immediately. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process that began with small acts of courage. I started writing about my history, putting into words what I had kept in silence for so long. and with every word written, something in me began to be freed. What happens when we decide to look back and face what hurts us? A transformation occurs. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it's profoundly necessary. Looking back requires courage because it involves reliving moments we would prefer to forget. What part of your history are you avoiding looking at directly? I asked myself one day while reviewing my life, and there in that question was the key. It's not just about looking back, but about doing so with intention, with the will to heal, to understand, to free yourself. It's not about blaming or reliving the suffering, but about giving a new meaning to what was, about integrating those parts of ourselves that we have rejected. I remember a conversation with my mother in which I asked her about her own history, about the moments she had never shared with me. "Why have we never talked about certain things?" I said. Her response was simple but profound. Because some wounds hurt too much, and we think that by not talking about them, they will disappear. But I knew, and she knew too, that silence doesn't heal. What happens when we decide to break that silence and face our own history? It happens that we begin to heal. How does our life change when we have the courage to look back? Everything changes. By observing our history with compassion, we not only better understand who we are, but also discover that we can free ourselves from the chains of the past. We can write a new chapter, one that isn't defined by pain or fear, but by consciousness and choice. By looking back, I saw not only my wounds, but also my strength. I saw how I had survived difficult moments, how I had found ways to move forward despite everything. What part of your history have you not honored? I asked myself. Because in the end, looking back isn't just about facing the pain, but also about recognizing the path we have traveled, the lessons we have learned, the victories we have achieved. The unseen inheritances, how the past lives in our genes and soul. There's something that always accompanies us, even if we don't see it. Something we haven't lived directly, but that we carry in our skin, in our deepest emotions. Is it possible that what we haven't experienced directly still affects us? I wondered. Over time, I understood that unseen inheritances, those marks of trauma from past generations, shape our lives in ways we don't always manage to understand. Remember a day when, for no apparent reason, I felt a deep sadness. There was no explanation. Where does this emotion come from that doesn't seem to have a root in my experience? At first, I thought it was just a bad patch, but the feeling persisted, like a cloud that wouldn't clear. Then, in a conversation with my mother, I discovered something she had never told me before. A family history of pain, of losses that had been silenced for generations. Is it possible that we carry within us the unresolved traumas of those who came before? I asked myself. Yes, it's possible, and it's even likely. Trauma doesn't completely disappear when we don't face it. It transforms, it hides, but it's still there, waiting to be healed. What part of our lives is being shaped by stories we have never heard? I have learned that our emotions, our reactions, are often not just our own. They are echoes of pains that have not found their end, pains that have been transmitted silently through time. Science has shown that trauma can change our biology, leaving marks on our DNA. How does unresolved trauma affect our decisions, our relationships, our way of seeing the world? I started to observe family dynamics more closely, the patterns that seemed to repeat, and I saw that without realizing it, I was reliving some of those old patterns. The fears I carried weren't always mine. The automatic responses to certain challenges weren't just the product of my experience, but of something deeper. One afternoon, while walking alone in the park, the idea came to me that maybe trauma manifests not to hurt us, but to be recognized. What would happen if instead of running from those emotions, we decided to listen to them? In that moment, I understood that unseen inheritances aren't just a burden. They are also an opportunity. an opportunity to heal what was never resolved, to give a new ending to stories that were left unfinished. My grandmother used to say that the things that aren't said stay in the air, looking for a place to land. Now I understand that those words were truer than I imagined. How can we heal the trauma that isn't directly ours, but that we carry within us? I started talking more with my family, asking, getting to know those stories that were never told. And with every story I heard, I felt a part of me being freed, that the weight I hadn't even recognized was beginning to dissipate. How do we break the cycle of inherited trauma? I asked myself. The answer isn't simple, but I believe it starts with awareness, with the will to look at what has been invisible for so long. The trauma we inherit doesn't have to define us. We can recognize it, honor it, and then let it go. What part of you is still being shaped by something that doesn't belong to you? That question accompanied me for a long time, and the more I explored it, the lighter I felt. I remember a conversation with my father in which I told him about this feeling of carrying a weight that wasn't mine. Have you ever felt that you're carrying something that isn't yours? I asked him. His response was a simple sentiment. Yes, sometimes it seems to me that we carry the ghosts of the past without knowing it, he told me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in this experience. Is it possible that by healing what isn't ours, we also free those who came before? I believe so. By healing, we not only free ourselves, but also our ancestors, those who never had the opportunity to heal their own pain. The path to emotional freedom. Untying the knots of the past throughout life, I've felt that our emotions are like interwoven threads, forming knots that sometimes imprison us, that prevent us from moving forward. Why is it so difficult for us to let go of the past? I asked myself as I tried to understand why, despite my efforts, I still felt that something inside me was tied. Every unresolved emotion, every unhealed memory becomes a knot that limits us, that keeps us tied to what has already been. I remember a moment in my life when I felt that every step I took was full of doubts. I had achieved many things, but something inside me was still anchored to the past. Is it possible to walk toward emotional freedom when we haven't untied the knots of the past? That question haunted me for years, until one day I decided that I couldn't continue to move forward without facing what was holding me back. It was then that I realized that every emotional knot hides a story, a pain that we haven't wanted or been able to release. What stories are hidden in the knots we carry inside? I began to reflect on my life, on the moments I had tried to forget but that were still present, intertwined with my current emotions, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. That the first step toward emotional freedom is to face those knots, to untie them one by one. How do we untie the emotional knots that tie us to the past? I constantly asked myself. For me, the answer came slowly, like a revelation that becomes evident over time. I began to see that it's not about forgetting the past or ignoring it, but about confronting it with compassion, about recognizing the wounds that still hurt and allowing ourselves to feel what we have avoided for so long. Every knot we untie is an act of liberation, an opportunity to heal. One day, talking with a friend, I confessed that I felt my life was full of knots that I didn't know how to undo. Have you ever felt that something is holding you back but you don't know exactly what it is? I asked her. With tears in her eyes, she nodded and told me. I feel that there are parts of me that are still trapped in moments that I haven't been able to leave behind. Her words resonated deeply in me. I realized that we all carry those knots inside, those emotions that, even if we try to ignore them, are still present, waiting to be released. What happens when we decide to untie the knots of the past? Something wonderful happens. Every knot we release brings us one step closer to emotional freedom. It's not an easy process, but it's profoundly transformative. By doing so, we begin to feel a lightness that we didn't know was possible. We begin to walk with more clarity, with more peace. How would your life change if you decided to let go of those emotional knots that have kept you tied for so long? I remember a day when, after a deep reflection, I decided to write a letter to my past. In it, I put everything I had kept, everything that had been left unsaid. How does it feel to express what we have kept in silence for so long? It was liberating. When I finished the letter, I felt as if one of those knots that had accompanied me for years finally came undone. I felt that by expressing what had been hidden, I was allowing my heart to open again. By untying those knots, I discovered something beautiful. Emotional freedom isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to embrace our emotions, to allow them, to flow without holding them back. What part of you is ready to be freed today? I ask myself every time I feel a new knot trying to form, and each time I realize that the process of untying isn't linear, that there are easier days than others, but that every step counts. Every small act of liberation brings us closer to peace. The strength of the bond. How to heal the relationship with parents. I've always believed that the relationship we have with our parents is one of the deepest and most complex bonds in our life. How is it possible that even when there's distance or pain, that bond never completely disappears? I asked myself, because even if we want to move away, even if time or wounds separate us, the bond with our parents is always present, sometimes in a silent but constant way. I remember a moment when I felt that the relationship with my mother was broken. Years had passed since we had had a sincere conversation, one of those that leave your heart open and vulnerable. Why is it so difficult to heal the wounds that have formed between parents and children? I thought. The accumulated emotions, the unfulfilled expectations, the fear of not being understood, all of that builds walls that over time seem impossible to tear down. One day, after an argument that left me emotionally exhausted, I sat alone in my room and asked myself, what part of me is still looking for my parents' love and approval? It was then that I realized that even as we grow and build our own identity, there's always a part of us that needs that bond, that deep connection with those who brought us into the world. But I also understood that to heal that relationship, I first had to heal my own perception of what it meant to be a daughter. How do we heal the relationship with our parents? I asked myself many times. The first step, I discovered, is to accept that they are also human, that they carry their own wounds, their own unresolved stories. By recognizing this, something in me changed. What happens when we stop seeing our parents as perfect figures and see them as people with their own struggles? I felt a compassion I had never felt before, an understanding that allowed me to approach them from a different place, not from demand or frustration, but from a genuine desire to heal. I remember a conversation with my father in which, for the first time in years, we decided to talk without blame, without reproach. How much of what we don't say creates distance in our family relationships? I asked him, and his answer surprised me. Perhaps the fear of not being understood makes us keep silent. That day, something in our relationship changed. By expressing what had been kept for so long, I felt that one of the biggest walls between us began to crumble. Is it possible to heal the relationship with our parents even after years of distance or conflict? The answer, for me, is yes, but it's not an easy or quick path. It requires will, vulnerability, and being willing to see ourselves and our parents from a new perspective. How can we heal the bond without reliving the pain? I learned that the key is in empathy, in the ability to see beyond our wounds and to recognize that we're all doing the best we can with what we've lived. One day, while talking to a friend, she confessed that she felt she had never been able to get emotionally close to her mother. It always seems like there's a barrier between us, she told me. I listened carefully and asked her, Have you tried talking to her from the heart, without expectations, just from the desire to understand her? She looked at me surprised, as if she had never considered that possibility. Sometimes we realize that in our eagerness to protect ourselves, we build barriers that distance us from those we love most. How does our life change when we decide to heal the relationship with our parents? Everything changes because by healing that bond, we also heal a part of ourselves. It's not about waiting for everything to be perfect or erasing the past, but about creating a new space where love and understanding can grow. What part of you is still waiting to heal that relationship? I ask myself every time I feel that the pain of the past tries to return, and instead of resisting, I choose to open up. I choose to see my parents with the eyes of the present, with a heart willing to forgive memories of the future. Transforming pain into wisdom, I have always believed that pain has a purpose, even when it feels impossible to understand. Is it possible that the suffering we face today is the seed of tomorrow's wisdom? I asked myself, over and over in the darkest moments of my life, because although we don't always see it clearly, pain not only shapes us but also teaches us, transforms us, and reveals parts of ourselves that we didn't know existed. I remember a time in my life when pain seemed to be the only thing I felt. It was a deep pain, one that I didn't know how to explain or how to face. What do we do when pain seems to have no way out? I asked myself. I felt that I was trapped in a cycle of suffering, one that seemed to have no end. But over time, I discovered something that would change my life. Pain is not the enemy. It is a teacher. What happens when we stop running from pain and face it with an open heart? A transformation occurs. It was in those moments of deep introspection that I began to see that every painful experience was, in some way, an opportunity to learn something about myself, about my fears, my desires, my limits. What can we learn from our own suffering? The answer doesn't always come immediately, but it's there, waiting to be discovered. In every scar, there's a lesson. In every wound, a truth that invites us to grow. One day, talking to my mother about a pain I had carried inside for years, she told me something I will never forget. Pain doesn't disappear, but it transforms. At first, I didn't fully understand her words, but over time I began to see how my own pain, when faced with love and patience, was transforming into wisdom, into an inner strength that I didn't know I had. How can we transform pain into something that strengthens us? The answer, I discovered, is in the way we choose to face it. It's not about ignoring or denying it, but about allowing ourselves to feel it, to let the pain show us what we need to learn. What part of your life could be transformed if you decided to see pain as a teacher instead of an enemy? I began to see that every time I allowed myself to feel instead of repressing, something inside me changed. The pain became lighter, less threatening, more understandable. I remember a conversation with a friend in which he confessed that he had spent years trying to run from his own pain, only to realize that the more he avoided it, the stronger it became. It's as if the pain doesn't go away until you decide to face it, he told me. And in his words, I found a truth that resonated deeply with me. Is it possible that by accepting pain we free ourselves from its power over us? Yes, it's possible. But it's not easy. What part of us changes when we decide to transform pain into wisdom? We become more compassionate, more aware of our emotions and those of others. We realize that pain is part of life, but that it doesn't have to define us. What would your life be like if the pain you feel today became the wisdom that will guide your future? That was the question that accompanied me as I continued to walk through my own healing process. One day, while meditating on the wounds I had carried for so long, I realized something beautiful. Pain is not permanent. Like everything in life, it passes, it changes, it evolves. What would happen if you began to see your pain not as an end, but as the beginning of something new? By transforming my perspective, I also transformed my experience. I no longer saw pain as something to avoid, but as something I could embrace with the certainty that by doing so, I was opening the door to a new way of being, healing the wounded soul. Tools for personal growth throughout my life. I have felt that the soul is like a garden, and emotional wounds are those areas that, if not cared for, become arid and lifeless. How do we heal the soul when it has been wounded by time, losses, or mistakes? I often asked myself. Over time, I learned that personal growth is not a destination, but a journey that involves healing those parts of us that have suffered the most, allowing us to flourish again. I remember a time when my soul seemed withered. I felt that there was nothing that could give me back the peace, the sense of well-being that I once had. What do we do when the soul seems to have lost its ability to heal? I thought. But over time I discovered that within every wound, there is also the seed of healing. I learned that the key is not to avoid pain, but to find the right tools to heal and continue growing. What are those tools we need to heal the wounded soul? I asked myself as I searched for answers. For me, the first and most important tool was self-compassion. How do we treat ourselves when we are suffering? Is a question each of us must ask ourselves. I discovered that instead of criticizing myself for my mistakes or feeling weak for my emotions, I needed to embrace myself with the same tenderness with which I would comfort a loved one. Compassion for oneself is the first door to healing. Another day, in a conversation with a therapist, he told me about the power of forgiveness, not only toward others but toward oneself. How many times do we hold on to guilt, thinking we don't deserve to be forgiven? I said to him. Forgiving yourself is the most powerful tool to heal the soul, he replied. It was in that moment that I understood that to move forward, I had to let go of the weight of my own judgments. Every emotional wound we don't forgive becomes an anchor that prevents us from growing. What else do we need to heal? I kept asking myself. The next tool I discovered was meditation. In stillness, in silence, I was able to hear what my soul was trying to tell me. What would our soul tell us if we gave it the space to express itself? In those moments of stillness, I found answers, but above all, I found peace. Meditation allowed me to reconnect with my essence, with the part of me that had always been intact despite the pain. I remember that in one of those meditations, an image came to my mind. It was as if I was tending an inner garden, watering those parts that I had previously neglected. How would our life change if we cared for our soul with the same dedication with which we care for other things? I began to realize that healing the soul requires time, patience, and, above all, dedication. It's not a linear process, but every small act of self-care counts. Another fundamental tool was continuous learning. What lessons can we extract from our wounds? I asked myself as I read and studied about personal growth. I realized that every difficult experience, every moment of pain, contained a lesson that could help me grow. Is it possible to transform pain into knowledge, into wisdom? Yes, it is. By learning from my experiences, I was able to see the value in them. I was able to understand that every obstacle we face prepares us for something greater. One afternoon, while walking in the park, I found myself reflecting on all the tools I had accumulated throughout my life. I realized that healing the soul is like building a personal toolkit, one that we can use whenever we feel lost or wounded. What tools have you accumulated to heal and grow? I asked myself, and in that moment I felt a deep gratitude for every small tool, every lesson that had allowed me to move forward. Beyond the pain. Finding purpose in adversity, I have always wondered if there is a hidden purpose behind pain. Why in moments of greatest adversity do we feel that we are walking aimlessly? I said to myself in the darkest moments of my life. Sometimes adversity seems like an endless storm, one that pushes us into places we never wanted to be. However, over time, I began to see that pain also brings with it a lesson, a call to discover something deeper within ourselves. I remember a particularly difficult time, one in which it seemed that every day brought with it a new burden, a new loss. How can we find meaning when everything seems to be against us? I asked myself. There were days when hope felt distant, like a light that was going out in the distance. But then something inside me changed. What happens when we stop resisting pain and accept it as part of our path? A transformation occurs. It was at that point of surrender, when I no longer had the strength to keep fighting against what I was feeling, that I began to see things in a different way. Is it possible that adversity has something to teach us even when it seems like there's nothing left to lose? I realized that by surrendering, I wasn't giving up the fight, but allowing myself to listen to the message that pain brought with it. Sometimes the purpose behind adversity is not immediate. It's not something we understand in the moment, but it's there, waiting to be discovered. How can we find purpose in the midst of pain? I asked myself over and over. The answer didn't come from a great moment of revelation, but from small flashes of clarity over time. I began to see that every challenge, every obstacle was preparing me for something greater. What if adversity were the teacher we didn't ask for, but that we need most? It was then that I understood that pain not only challenges us, but also shapes us and transforms us. One afternoon, while talking with a friend who had gone through a devastating loss, he told me something that resonated deeply with me. Sometimes the purpose isn't evident until the pain has passed. In that moment, I knew he was right. In the middle of the storm, it's difficult to see clearly, but once the pain begins to dissipate, we start to see that every difficult experience has left us with something invaluable. What part of your life has been transformed by adversity? I asked myself constantly, and each time I found new answers. I remember reading about people who, after facing great challenges, found a purpose they had not previously considered. Is it possible that our greatest trials lead us to discover our deepest purpose? For me, that was a truth that took me a long time to accept. But over time, I realized that by facing pain, I was also opening the door to a new version of myself. A stronger, wiser version, more connected to my true self. What can we learn from pain that will prepare us for the future? I asked myself as I reflected on my own experiences. What I learned is that pain not only teaches us about the fragility of life, but also about our own capacity to overcome it. It shows us that we are more resilient than we think, and that even in the darkest moments, there is a spark of light waiting to be discovered. How would your life change if you saw adversity as an opportunity instead of a curse? One day, after a long walk through the forest, I understood something essential. Purpose isn't always found in the destination, but in the path we travel to get there. By stopping my search for immediate answers and allowing time to show me the purpose of each challenge, I began to feel a peace I had not known before. What part of you is ready to find the purpose behind the pain you have lived? I asked myself. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to let adversity teach me what it had come to teach me. The light in the shadow. Overcoming emotional darkness. There are moments in life when emotional darkness seems to envelop everything, as if there were no way out, as if the light that once shone within us had faded. How can we find the light when we are trapped in the shadow of our own emotions? I asked myself in those days when sadness seemed to have no end. But over time, I discovered something that would change me forever. Even in the shadow, there are glimmers of light waiting to be discovered. I remember a moment in my life when I felt that emotional darkness was overwhelming me. I didn't know how to move forward or how to find meaning in the midst of the internal chaos. What do we do when sadness or fear paralyze us? I thought. It was as if I had lost control of my own life, as if negative emotions had taken the reins. But then something inside me began to change. Is it possible that in the darkness, we find the space to discover a new version of ourselves? One afternoon, while walking in the rain, I realized that even though everything seemed gray, there was something comforting in the sound of the drops hitting the ground. Can we find beauty even in moments of darkness? I asked myself. It was in that moment that I understood that darkness isn't something we should fear, but something we can accept as part of the process of transformation. How would our life change if we saw darkness not as an enemy, but as an ally in our growth? The key to overcoming emotional darkness, I discovered, is in learning to be with it, to allow ourselves to feel it without resisting. What happens when we stop running from our deepest emotions? I decided to accept them. Instead of fighting against sadness or fear, I decided to accept them as part of my human experience. By doing so, something beautiful began to happen. The emotions lost their power over me. They were no longer invisible monsters that terrified me at night, but parts of me that needed to be heard and understood. One day, talking with a friend who was also going through a difficult time, I asked her, "Have you noticed that the more we try to avoid darkness, the stronger it becomes?" She nodded, and together, we reflected on how by facing our emotions, we are also giving ourselves the opportunity to find the light in the midst of the shadow. "What part of you needs to be illuminated in this moment of darkness?" I asked her, and in that exchange of words, we both began to see that we were not alone in our struggle. How can we find the light when everything seems dark? I kept asking myself. The answer came slowly, in small moments of clarity. The light has always been inside us. It's not about looking for it outside, but about lighting it from within. By accepting darkness, we allow our own light to shine more brightly. Is it possible that darkness is the fertile ground where our inner light can grow? Over time, I understood that yes, it is, because in the end, light and shadow are part of the same essence, and one cannot exist without the other. I remember one afternoon while meditating, I felt a deep inner peace. I had been carrying so many emotions, so much weight, that I forgot that peace was also available to me, even in the middle of the storm. How can we find peace in the midst of emotional chaos? I thought. And then I understood it. Peace is not the absence of darkness, but the acceptance that darkness is also part of the journey. By allowing my heart to open to the totality of my emotions, I felt that something in me was being freed. Closing cycles. A journey to peace and healing. Throughout my life, I have learned that to be able to move forward, it's necessary to close cycles. Why is it so hard for us to close the doors of the past? I asked myself, while carrying unresolved stories, unfinished relationships, and emotions that never finished healing. Closing cycles isn't an act of forgetting, but of integrating what has been lived to find peace and to allow ourselves to move forward without the invisible chains that tie us to yesterday. I remember a key moment in my life when I realized that I was clinging to a situation that no longer existed. What happens when we cling to something that no longer has a place in our present? I asked myself. The answer came slowly, with the weight of accumulated fatigue from trying to keep a story alive that had already ended. In the end, I realized that it wasn't the situation itself that hurt, but my resistance to letting it go. How do we learn to let go of what no longer serves us? It was in those moments of reflection that I began to understand that closing cycles is an act of self-love. What part of you is still waiting for an ending that never came? I asked myself while reviewing my history with new eyes. I realized that on many occasions, it's not the other person who has to close the cycle for us. It's us who must find the courage to say goodbye, to let go of the weight we have carried for so long. One day, talking to a friend about a relationship that had not ended well, she told me, "Sometimes the closure we seek doesn't come from outside, but from within." Her words resonated deeply in me. Is it possible that emotional closure doesn't depend on the other person but on our own ability to forgive and accept? In that moment, I knew that I couldn't wait for closure to come from someone else. I had to find it within myself, through forgiveness, acceptance, and the recognition that even if the cycle has ended, what I lived will always be a part of me. How do we close a cycle in a healthy way? I asked myself. I discovered that the key is in gratitude. Being grateful for what was, for what it taught us, even if it caused us pain. What can we learn by looking back with compassionate eyes? By accepting my history with its moments of light and shadow, I began to feel a peace I had not known before. I understood that every experience, every relationship, every emotion had a purpose, even if I didn't see it at the time. One afternoon, while meditating on closing cycles, I realized something important. We can't open ourselves to the new if we haven't closed the old. What new doors could open in your life if you allowed yourself to close the old ones? I asked myself. By letting go of what no longer had a place in my present, I felt that the space that had been occupied by pain, resentment, or sadness began to be filled with peace, new opportunities, and hope. I remember a conversation with my mother in which I told her how I had learned to close cycles. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration and told me, "I always thought that closing cycles meant forgetting, but now I see that it's much more than that. It's remembering with love without clinging." Her words made me understand that true closure doesn't involve erasing the past, but integrating it, accepting it, and moving forward with a lighter heart. How does our life change when we learn to close cycles? I asked myself. What I discovered is that closing cycles frees us. It gives us permission to move forward without the burden of unresolved pain. It allows us to look toward the future with hope instead of remaining trapped in the past. What part of you is ready to close a cycle and open up to the new? That question accompanied me as I continued my journey toward peace and healing. If this audiobook has inspired you, imagine what you can discover with many more. Don't let knowledge and spiritual growth stay here. Explore our complete playlist and immerse yourself in more transformative wisdom. And if you truly want to elevate your life from different points of view on spirituality, I invite you to visit my channel, Chronicle of Knowledge, where you will find deep spiritual content to continue expanding your mind and being. Don't miss the opportunity to continue transforming your reality. Take the next step now. Thank you very much.